Well, I hope you took the time to watch that video and saw, the arguments regarding the media being a driving force behind the development of anorexia. I'd like to add some psychological components to it. A lot of people who are diagnosed with anorexia have also been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, also known as OCD, um, so that they become obsessed with weight, and then they are compelled, the compulsion part, they're compelled to reduce it. They become obsessed with food, and so they're compelled to think about it, to interact with it, but not eat it, things like that. And part of the reason why they become fixated on weight restriction is because of their sense of perfectionism, that they'll set themselves goals, and they'll say, I can only consume. I had a student once who told me that she only consumed 150 calories a day. She was about to be hospitalized, and that's why we were talking about it, because she was going to miss class. And she told me she ate 150 calories a day, and she very carefully laid out exactly what she allowed herself to consume across the day that added up to 150 calories, and she felt gave her like a balanced diet, because it had some fats, and it was very disordered the way that she considered herself to be having a healthy diet as she was restricting herself to 150 calories. um, After we were done talking, I was walking away, I looked at the snack that I always keep in my bag in case I get hungry between meals, and it was a little snack pack of raisins that was like 250 calories. I'm like, my snack is more than she'll eat all day. Um, and that's, she had her goal, she had her plan, and she was going to adhere to it, because if she didn't, she would fail. And the reason why she was talking to me about it is because, she had perfect grades in my class. She hadn't missed an assignment. She had done everything perfectly. And she was very distressed that she was going to be hospitalized, and it was going to prevent her from completing the class perfectly. And, that was very upsetting to her. She was willing to, she argued really vehemently to not be hospitalized till the quarter was over, because she did not want withdrawals on her transcript. So very much this sort of perfectionistic emphasis on everything has to be perfect. Now, for a subset of people with anorexia, it ultimately comes to light that they may have been sexually abused when they were younger. And one hypothesis or theory about why anorexia would emerge from sexual abuse is that there's this, for one thing, anorexia oftentimes causes periods to stop. So one of the most outward signs of maturity being, having a period, that goes away. And then as you lose fat, you tend to lose your curves, you tend to lose your breasts, you tend to lose any of the fat deposition that you had. And so that takes away the secondary sex characteristic signs of maturity. And so for the person, and then a lot of times people with anorexia, you lose your hair. And so you may lose your pubic hair and your armpit hair and other signs of maturity. And so for the person who was victimized as a child, and then knows that the next phase of their adulthood is that they're supposed to find a partner and have sexual contact and all these things that are part of normal, healthy adult functioning, they're like, I don't want any part of that. And one way to avoid it is to stay immature looking, they think. This is not every anorexic, but this has been reported in a subset, that it may be a way of coping with their feelings that their body has been betrayed, that they don't really control their body, somebody else victimized them. And so the one thing that they can have control over is what they eat and how they look. And so that's one theory about what might trigger anorexia in certain individuals. Now, bulimia, a lot of people think of as being the opposite of anorexia. So if anorexia is where you don't eat enough, bulimia is where you eat too much. But that's really a simplification, because in bulimia, the characteristic that must be met is that the person engages in binge eating. And binges would be at a single sitting consuming at least 1,500 calories. And for most people, it maxes out somewhere around 3,000, but it could be even more depending on what kind of, calorically dense food they're consuming. And then it's followed by some kind of purge. And the stereotype is that the purge would be vomiting, but it sometimes is. But it can also be a purge through the use of laxatives or diuretics. Laxatives, of course, you know what that does, clears out your bowels. Diuretics cause the absorption of water out of your cells so that you'll eliminate it through urine. They might purge through vigorous exercise. They might feel like if they, run really a long ways, that would get rid of the calories that they just consumed. Something like that. Or they, engage in, back-to-back aerobic classes or something, trying to purge those calories that they just consumed. Just FYI, an hour-long aerobics class is going to consume 500 calories, something like that. So one of the things that we find with people who have bulimia is that they don't necessarily lose weight. It's not really a great way to lose weight because you consume these calories. Some amount of it is processed by your body before you start vomiting, or before the laxatives can have their effect, or the vigorous exercise usually is nowhere near enough to actually clear out those calories. So generally, a person with bulimia doesn't really lose weight. And so that makes them even more frustrated and disgusted with themselves because they say, I'm not losing weight because of that binge that I had. So that's it. I'm going to go in a really restricted diet. I'm just not going to let myself eat too much. I'm just not going to do it. And then when they lose control again and have a binge, then they feel a lot of shame. And it's this cycle where, having, periods where they try to exert just an overwhelming amount of control, failing in that causes them to, they ate one cookie and they go, oh, well, I failed. I might as well eat the package. And it's this cycle. Now I got to get rid of that. So you typically see that they don't lose significant weight. Typically, a person with bulimia is just overwhelmed with negative emotions. They feel like their body isn't good enough. They feel like they're not good enough because they keep succumbing to this, they keep losing their willpower. And so just overall, they're anxious, depressed, shamed. So the binge purge cycle starts with, strict dieting. That's it. I'm going on a diet. I'm not eating this stuff anymore. The diet slips or some kind of difficult situation arises where they're, under stress or something like that, and they then have a binge. They do their purge to try and avoid gaining weight, and then they feel shame, and then they feel self-hatred. They feel like if anybody knew what I was doing, they would all be so disgusted, and people think that I have it all together and I really don't. And I know people are going to tell me that I'm going to hurt myself by doing these behaviors, but I can't help it. And so they just have all this secrecy about it and this feeling of just overwhelming, guilt, shame, remorse. I'm a horrible person kinds of thoughts. And so it's this cycle. And so when they feel all shamed about what they just did, they go, that's it. I'm sticking to the diet this time. And then the cycle starts over again. All right, so we have got the eating disorder issue. We also have, teenagers using drugs and alcohol. So here we have across the bottom the different years. So we go back to 1975 and as recent as 2013. Alcohol is the most common substance that a teenager has used. And this is a poll of just people who are high school seniors, and they are just reporting whether they have used any of these things in the past 30 days. So we see that alcohol is the most common. You see the row below it that's also a shade of red that says that they used alcohol till they got drunk. So some subset is using alcohol but not necessarily getting drunk, and but a lot of the people who are using alcohol are using it to the point of drunkenness. We see that the rate of cigarette use has really gone down since 1995-ish kind of thing. Really when people really they started making laws against it and really cracking down on cigarettes. We see that marijuana has been going up, and I do not have the most recent numbers on this, but as more states legalize it, this number state by state has been going up. I just don't have national numbers on it. Then we see smokeless tobacco, and we see boys using it more than girls. Girls hardly use it at all, but boys are really starting to use smokeless tobacco of all different kinds. This, if you go back as far as 1992, we're talking about I can't think of another word for it, but like dip, right? The kind that you put in your mouth. But as we're getting into the more modern era, it's including vaping, and a lot of teenagers have been using that. And sometimes they vape tobacco or nicotine, and other times they vape, marijuana derivatives. So there's different kinds of things that are going into those vaping pens. If we look at the past year use of various drugs, so if we zoom in just on drugs, so we're taking out we're taking out alcohol, we're taking out marijuana, we're taking out tobacco, and we're just looking at the really illicit types of drugs, the harder things you might think about. And our dates range from 1991 to 2013 on this one. And this is all grades combined. So this is, whether the person has used this substance in the past year, and we're not really concerned about what grade they're in. So you'll see that, we had this peak use of inhalants and hallucinogens back in the mid 90s, and they've been on the decline. Ecstasy had a nice spike in 01, kind of went down, and then it started coming back in, the late 00s, early teens. And then we see cocaine use. It's basically flat in that purple line, but it did peak in the late 90s. And then we have the heroin use along the bottom that's been reasonably stable across time and very low. So don't forget to look at that y-axis where we're seeing the percent of people who report that they've used it. And so we're looking at the max peak of inhalants being about 10%, right? And the vast majority we're looking at, by 2013, less than 5% of people reporting using any of these things. So luckily, it's a small subset, but I was just talking to somebody else the other day that, if only 2% of Americans believe something, that means like 6 million people believe it. So if you're talking about 5% of teenagers using a substance, that's a large number of people who are using that substance, and that could be a significant problem in society. If we look at the last 2 decades, being our numbers end in 2015 now in this infographic. So from 1995 to 2015, you see that alcohol use has been slightly declining, cigarette use significantly declining. Illicit drugs, they kind of go up, they kind of go down. Which one's popular in any given year kind of goes up, kind of goes down, but they tend to be pretty stable. Some kind of illicit drug use, about 20% of teenagers. And so if you look across the bottom, you'll see that they have 10th graders versus 12th graders versus 8th graders. And yeah, you'll find that the younger the kid is, the less likely they are to report this kind of thing. And by the way, this is use in the past month. I keep hopping back and forth. So one graphic was 1 month. They reported as 30 days. Another graphic was a year. This one's a month. So in the past month, have you used this? So we have some significant declines in alcohol and cigarettes, and then some stability across the illicit drug use. Now, what about teenage pregnancy? The good news is that it has been significantly declining since 1995. And this is the first time we have seen a decline since the 1930s. Now, that's kind of a misleading statement to say, because for one thing, yes, there were teenagers having babies in the 1930s. But we have to remember that when we talk about teenage pregnancies, this is anyone, you'll notice across the bottom it says aged 15 to 19. So 19 is being included as a teenager because, of course, has the suffix teen on it. But in the 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe even into the 60s, it was very common for an 18 or a 19-year-old girl to be married. It was very common. So we can't really lump that kind of teenage pregnancy, occurring within a marriage, to what we all are thinking about in 2021 about what we mean by a teenage pregnancy, right? We're talking about an unplanned pregnancy to a woman who's not married, or a girl who's not married, and didn't plan it, right? They weren't looking for it. So this is across countries, right? So we see that, I guess we should say USA, we're number one, because we are definitely higher than other places. This number is 2011. I can't find a more recent graphic, so hopefully it'll come out soon because it's been 10 years. And our numbers have been going down. I would like to see us compared to other countries now. I don't know if they've all been going down at the same rate we are or what. Um, so we have the highest rates of pregnancies. And then I thought this graphic might be interesting to you because it reveals what happens to those pregnancies, right? So the darkest orange is the rate of abortion. The lightest kind of pinkish is actually resulted in birth. And then on the far right is the rate of miscarriage. So one of the things that I think is important for you to notice about countries that have lower teenage birth rates than the US has, those countries have higher abortion rates. So that kind of gives us the impression that, you know, there are pregnancies that occur. They don't just, it's just the case that they don't all result in births. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when you look at these different countries. So now here's another look at it, and this is the rate per 1,000 women who are between the ages of 15 and 19. This is just the US. And so this is looking at it across time. On the x-axis, you see it starts in 1975 and goes through 2013. And see that precipitous drop in pregnancy rate that I told you about since 1995. It's really been going down. It had been very stably, a little up and down-ish kind of up until 1995, but really just started dropping. And one big factor that we think is contributing to that is the destigmatization of condoms. People used to not use condoms because if you've ever seen Austin Power, he goes, rubbers, that's for sailors. And the assumption was only a dirty person would ask to use a condom, right? Now we are realizing that condoms protect from a lot of things, and including pregnancy. What do you know about that? And so the destigmatization of condoms, I think, has really contributed to this precipitous drop. So when we look at different states, we can see the pregnancy rate in the different states. And so you're probably, if you're one of my students, you're looking to see where does Washington fall in that. We're between 34 and 38 pregnancies per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19. So we're in one of the lower groups. We're not in the lowest, but we're in one of the lower groups. So one of the things that we all are aware of is that teenage pregnancy bad, right? So why teenage pregnancy bad? Why do we say that? What are the consequences of teenage pregnancy? One is higher rates of complication during the pregnancy. The younger a person is when they are pregnant, the more likely they are to suffer from anemia, which is where they haven't got enough oxygen carrying cells. They're more likely to endure a prolonged labor. Prolonged is considered, I don't want to scare anybody off who hasn't had kids yet, but a prolonged labor is considered more than 12 hours of labor on a first birth. Toxemia, which is a complication of birth where they have an infection, basically. Some of the social effects for mom: she is less likely to complete her education. She is more likely to experience financial troubles. She's more likely to have another pregnancy while still a teenager. I mean, all moms are going to suffer from repeat pregnancies because most moms who have one baby have a second baby. But for a teenage mom, what we're talking about is another pregnancy while still a teen. One of the complications for the baby would be low birth weight is twice as common among babies born to teenage moms than to babies born to moms who are in sort of the prime age group of 20 to 32-ish, 33. Double the rate of low birth weight for babies born to teenage moms. Triple the likelihood of death within the first year of life. More likely to suffer from low IQ scores than babies born to older, 20s to 1930, being in their 20s to 32 years old. More likely to display behavior problems that are, going to result in diagnoses of ADHD or other kinds of things once they get to school. More likely to display learning disabilities where they're more than 2 years behind on either reading or math. For the child, the social effects, they tend to display lower achievement while they're in high school. They're more likely to become a teenage parent themselves. So these are things that you can now see why, if these are common problems that go along with teenage pregnancy, you can see why people say, we want to limit teenage pregnancy. If we can stave off first birth to after the age of 20, a lot of these complications and social effects are reduced. So what causes teenage pregnancy? Well, you'll have to take my human sexuality class if you want the explicit description of what causes it. But let's kind of talk more conceptually about the fact that teenagers are the ones who are less likely to use contraception. They oftentimes will report that they just got swept away in the moment and they didn't know that there was going to be any kind of sexual intercourse that night or that at that event, and so they they thought maybe I shouldn't, but then they were like, well, I just got swept away in the emotions. The more sex guilt the person has, the more likely they are to report that they got swept away. Um, the less sex guilt, the more likely a person is to actually have contraception with them when they have intercourse. Some people will report that they don't want to use contraception, or that they don't care if they get pregnant, or that they actually wanted to get pregnant. So a lot of times we think about teenage moms being, sort of, it's always an accident. But for some teenage moms, they think it'll be a way of solidifying their relationship with the dad, which is almost always faulty logic. It doesn't, in most cases, result in a solidifying of the relationship. Um, Sometimes they'll say things, well, I don't want to be on the pill because of the hormones, as if that's the only way to prevent pregnancy, right? Like my boyfriend won't use condoms, as if that's the only way to prevent pregnancy. So there's a lack of knowledge maybe about what alternatives they have that might like be fueling their I don't want to use it argument. The don't care is kind of an interesting thing that teenage moms will say. They'll say, well, I don't care one way or another. Um, some of you might be old enough to remember back in the 90s, Nike did this whole push on, girls who are in sports are less likely to become pregnant and are more likely to go to college, and all these benefits of sports. Really, the more things that a girl has to look forward to, or a boy has to look forward to as far as their future, the less likely they are to say that they don't care if they become pregnant while they're teenagers, or they don't care if they impregnate somebody when they're teenagers. So the more future oriented the teen is, the less likely they are to say that they don't care. Sometimes they don't have contraception because they don't really know about their alternatives, or they don't know where to get it. They're embarrassed. A lot of stores put condoms behind a counter because condoms are the number one most shoplifted items. The next most shoplifted are razor blades because they're so expensive. But putting them behind a counter means that a teenager has to go and ask an adult to get them the condoms from behind the counter, and it's embarrassing. I assign my human sexuality students to, they don't have to buy the condoms, but they have to go to a like normal store, Safeway or Walmart or something like that, go to a regular store, go where the condoms are, and, choose what they would want to have, ask for it if they have to get behind the counter. And it's embarrassing. They have to write a report on how embarrassing it is. And these are college students. So for a teenager, the idea of going into a public place and buying condoms can be overwhelmingly embarrassing, and they just don't do it. Um, they may think they're invincible. That's the kind of thing that happens to somebody else. It wouldn't happen to me. Why would it happen to me? It happens to somebody else. So that invincibility fallacy might contribute as well. So when they asked sexually active teenagers whether they used birth control when they had sexual intercourse, 33% said that they never did, and 67% said that they didn't always use contraception. And in fact, for the typical girl, she does not use contraception during her first intercourse. On average, she does not. The younger she is, the more likely she is to not use contraception at her first intercourse. If you can delay onset of first intercourse past the age of 16, it becomes more and more likely that contraception will be used. But the younger the girl is, the less likely she is to use contraception. And in fact, the typical younger teen who starts to have sexual intercourse doesn't start using contraception for at least a year after she's become sexually active. Now, if you can delay past the age of 16, that window narrows to there may be 1 or 2 incidences of unprotected sex, but then they start to use contraception. So the older the teenager is, the more likely. So if a person waits till they're 18, almost always they have contraception at their first intercourse. So the later you can wait, the better. Another cause of teenage pregnancy is that they might have contraception with them, but they didn't use it correctly. Um, Only 40% of girls who say they're on the pill actually take it every day. That's not very good. Like the majority are not correctly taking the pill. You not only have to take 1 pill every day, for the most efficacy, you need to take it at roughly the same time every day. So it's really super important that that consistency occur if a person wants to actually prevent pregnancy. So incorrect use of the pill is really common. Incorrect use of condoms is really common. Now, I'm not going to show you how to put a condom on a banana or something. We're not doing that. I will just tell you that in a survey of teenagers, 33 to 50%, depending on which survey we look at, didn't know that they needed to leave a space at the end of the condom. Most condoms today come with what's called a reservoir tip. You're not supposed to stretch that out. That's supposed to be there to catch the ejaculate. So you're supposed to leave it there. 33 to 50% thought it was okay to use Vaseline as a lubricant with a condom. Vaseline eats condoms, literally dissolves them. So you don't use Vaseline or hand lotion or even canola oil will eat a condom. So you want to make sure that you're using a water-based lubricant with a condom. Most condoms today come lubricated, so they're fine. Just use that. 20% believe that a lambskin condom would protect better against HIV than latex condoms do, which is very false. First off, you may not have even known that there are such a thing as lambskin condoms. They're kind of getting more popular now that people are getting sort of like organic and they think latex will give them an allergy or other things. Lambskin condoms are literally made out of lamb intestines, and they have pores in them that would allow the transmission of HIV and, in fact, sperm through the pores. And so if you use them incorrectly, you can end up pregnant with lambskin condoms. They are really super expensive, so I would just recommend stay away from the lambskin condoms. So what about characteristics of the teenage girl that makes it more likely she might become a teen mom? So let's look at racial differences. And this is with the blue bars, it's data from 1991. Green is 2007, and periwinkle is 2011. And this is the rate per 1,000 teenagers in the 15 to 19 age group. So if you look across all races, you see that across time from 1991 to 2011, the rates have been going down. So that's good. But if you start to look at different racial groups, you can see different kinds of patterns. So everybody across all racial groups, 1991 was much higher rates of teen pregnancy. But look at the rates of, Asian or Pacific Islander versus non-Hispanic Black. You're seeing much higher rates among non-Hispanic Blacks and then Hispanics than you are among Asian or Pacific Islanders or non-Hispanic whites. And you've got American Indian or Alaskan Native being, sort of in the middle there. Different racial groups sort of have different values about contraception, about what a pregnancy means, about, for example, the masculinity of the father, about the personality or value of the mom. And so different cultures have different attitudes, even within the US, right? Different cultures have different attitudes about what it means. And so these rates can vary across racial groups. The good news is across all racial groups, it has been declining. And so that's what we need to focus on. And, to tell a group that their cultural values are inappropriate is not very respectful, really. And if you think about it, as I mentioned before, if you talk about the 1930s through the 60s, that it was very common for women to be married by 18 or 19. And so these teen pregnancies don't really mean the same thing back then as they might mean today. Within these cultures, the teenage pregnancies might not mean the same thing as they do in the cultures that have lower rates, right? So that's something else to be really thinking about. The fact that there are biological complications for the mom and the baby, now those are things to worry about. Right. And so if we can convince cultures that for their own health and for their future baby's health, it would be better to wait until they're older. That's a better message than to tell a cultural group that values pregnancy, you guys need to stop doing that because of economic reasons or something like that. That's probably not going to have as big of an impact on that group. But if a woman can wait until she's over 20 years old, on average, she's going to have fewer complications. I just keep having to say on the other end of it, though, you also want to be less than 32 to avoid the complications that come with aging. So somewhere between 20 and 32 is the ideal range on average. So ethnicity can be one factor that can contribute to teenage pregnancy. Goal orientation, I was mentioning that earlier, right? Like if you're looking ahead to your future, you are more likely to take the steps to prevent pregnancy in your present. Sex guilt, I mentioned this already, right? If you have a belief that you shouldn't be having sex and that you're not going to admit anything about your sexual impulses or where you think this relationship is going with your partner or any of those things, if you're suffering from a lot of sex guilt, you're more likely to go with that swept away argument. Characteristics of a teen mom, the younger, like I said, the younger the teenager, the less likely they are to have contraception. The bigger the disparity between the girl and her male partner, the less likely she is to have contraception, which is kind of interesting. But a lot of times there's a power differential between a girl who's significantly younger than her male partner, and she may not have the nerve to tell him to use a condom, and she doesn't want to use hormonal birth control methods, or doesn't want to go to the doctor and get measured for a diaphragm or any of the other more intrusive things that a girl would have to do. And he doesn't want to use a condom. Well, we may just be having unprotected sex then, because the girl being younger than her partner may not be able to stand up. I mentioned this part already, that the younger the girl is when she starts to have sex, the longer period of time there will be before she starts to use birth control. Now, the important thing to note about that story is that half of all teenage pregnancies occurred within the first 6 months that the girl was sexually active. So waiting a year before you get your birth control in place probably is going to be a moot point for half of the girls who are sort of waiting to see what happens. So having birth control already lined up is a really important thing. Relying on your partner for birth control. Like I said, if the girl is much younger than her partner, he may be in a position where he just says, I don't want it, but we're still having sex. When we're talking about peers, girls who are roughly the same age as their male partner, she may have a little more leverage with him and might be able to get him to use a condom. But if she's relying on him to bring a condom and then to use a condom, she's more likely to end up pregnant. If she has her own condoms and insists that he puts them on, there's going to be a lower likelihood of pregnancy, obviously. So a lot of my students in my human sexuality classes say, well, we need better sex education in schools. And that's a really good argument. I'd like to talk a little bit about where teenagers get their information about birth control. So we've got the males on the left and the females on the right in these bars, and then this is a stacked bar graph. So at the very bottom would be they didn't get information from either their parents or from schools. The next one up, the next shade up is they got their information about birth control just from school. The lightest bar, they got the information just from their parents. And then the top bar is they report they got the information from both school and their parents. So you see that there's a mixture of formal instruction by itself, and then formal information plus parents being the most common source of information. There's a subset of people who didn't get it anywhere. They don't know anything about birth control. And there's a subset who only got it from their parents. So that's where kids tend to be getting it. When kids get educated about sex in school, there are largely two approaches. There's really three, but this is not a human sexuality class. I'm not going to go into super detail. We have basically the dichotomy between abstinence only, which is focused on teaching kids to wait, and then the safe sex approach, which encourages kids to wait, but acknowledges that they may become sexual, and as a result, we want to give you information about birth control, abortion, and other sexually transmitted infections, things like that. So, how helpful was this information? In the abstinence-only approach, they were much more likely to say that the information was not very helpful, and then they were less likely to say that it was fairly helpful or very helpful. So we have a little bit of a disparity in the teenagers' view of the kind of information that they got from an abstinence-only approach than what they got from a safe sex approach. What I would like to point out as a final note on sex education, and I thought I had a graphic, but I must have put that in my human sexuality slides, not here, is that the average teenager says that their number one preferred source of information about sex is their parents. They really would rather learn, I say parents, but they mean an adult that they, a family member who's an adult who they trust. And so it could be an uncle or an aunt or an older cousin or somebody who knows. That's their number one preferred source of information. Way down on the list was getting it from school. Teenagers want to hear not just about the mechanics of sex and how to avoid pregnancy and how to avoid STIs. They don't want to hear just the mechanics. They want to hear about the stuff that the schools aren't usually going to talk about, because it includes values. And so they want to know, what do you think about this adult who I trust? What value would you place on engaging in sex when I'm 16? Or what value would you place on arriving at a potential sexual encounter with condoms in my purse or in my wallet? Things like that. And so teenagers, by and large, want to hear from somebody that they trust. They don't really want to hear it from school. And so as potential parents of people in the future, or current parents of people right now, I would just like to encourage you that if you have the opportunity to talk to a young person about sexual issues, you knowing enough about it and feeling confident because you've gone through some classes and things, you should be able to have that kind of conversation with a child who who looks up to you, and talk to them about the emotions and all the stuff that the schools don't really talk about. So that's what I want to end with, is empowering you to talk to the kids in your life. All right, I'm going to leave you here, and our next chapter will be on cognition.